Let's continue our very interesting workshop, and I'm quite pleased to be here, even if, in order to quote Robert Jan, I'm a complete outsider in the fact. So I'm going to discover many things, and I'm quite interested in this very interesting combination between at least archaeology, history, politics, and just in order to quote to remember an anecdote, I was in 2007 in Bosnia, and it was for the annual meeting of the International Association of Genocide Scholars, and we had a visit to Srebrenica, and a mass grave had been discovered by chance shortly before the meeting, and we had the opportunity to have such an excursion organized to the mass grave, and it was indeed, in a very real way, this political utilization of a mass grave. So it was what I had in mind was while I was listening to the presentations before. So let's go to let's switch from politics to methodology, even if in the very title of the panel with contested methodology, I think we will have also some discussions about the topic we will hear about. Two things. We will have a bilingual panel, since the two first presentations will be in English and the two last ones are going to be in German. So we will have to switch our minds, our brains, in order to get in the topics afterwards. And we will begin. I'm not going to present her since she is already presented in the brochure we all have got. Caroline Colls, who is not present, but we will hear her thanks to an MP4 presentation, and this will be a maybe complicated combination between this audio presentation and a PowerPoint she sent us. So you are, I'm the master of time, you are the master of technology, and I hope it's going to be as easily as possible. So let's begin with the presentation by Caroline Colls.
Colleagues and friends, it is with deep regret that I am unable to join you today in Vienna for the Forensic Turn in Holocaust Studies conference to present my paper in person. Somewhat ironically, it is the Forensic Turn in Holocaust Studies that has prevented me from attending, since I'm currently engaged in fieldwork. I would, of course, be happy to take any questions that you have about my paper via email after the conference. Earth conceal not my blood. It is this statement that every visitor to Sobibor in Poland used to be faced with as they entered the memorial site that marks the former Nazi camp that existed there from April 1942 to October 1943. This statement echoed the biblical statement in the book of Job, in which Job pleads, "O earth, cover not thou my blood, and let my cry have no resting place." Although there have been different interpretations of this statement, one assumption here is that Job is calling for justice. He believes that if blood is covered, murderers will not be called to account for the crimes they have perpetrated, and innocent victims will be forgotten. At Sobibor, this statement seems to have been used in a similar way. Here we see the human body used as a way to ask visitors to remember the crimes committed there and to never forget those who perished during the Holocaust. The perception of graves and corpses as evidence of Nazi crimes and as proof of life was not only a post-war phenomenon. During the Holocaust, many attempts were made to alert the wider world to the crimes being perpetrated by burying or hiding physical evidence. For example, speaking about Treblinka extermination camp, survivor Abraham Goldfarb stated, "We secretly placed in the walls of graves whole skeletons, and we wrote on scraps of paper what the Germans were doing at Treblinka. If one day someone looked for the traces of the Nazi crimes, they could indeed be found." Many testimonies like this one also suggest that the victims and witnesses of these atrocities expected searches for the victims to be carried out in the aftermath of conflict. However, despite these sentiments, the earth continues to conceal the remains of those killed at places like Sobibor and Treblinka. Although the existence of post-war legal trials, historical inquiries and images in the media lead us to believe that the events of the Holocaust are well known, there have actually been very few investigations throughout Europe that have sought to locate burial sites and the remains of Holocaust victims in the years since the Second World War. Of those searches that have been undertaken, few have drawn upon the techniques now commonly used by forensic practitioners and archaeologists during the investigations of the recent and distant past. Additionally, many of those who have attempted to examine human remains of Holocaust victims have had limitations placed upon their work. Consequently, very little is actually known about the majority of victims, their fates, and exactly what happened to their remains. Thousands of burials thus remain unlocated and unmarked. This situation presents something of a paradox. Why do corpses form a central part of Holocaust iconography, and yet they remain elusive in the physical sense? Why haven't large-scale searches for Holocaust victims been carried out? How is it possible that the remains of so many people have not been found? And how might we go about finding them in the future? Through the presentation of a case study from the author's own research, this paper will consider these questions and highlight the challenges that archaeologists will face should they choose to investigate Holocaust sites in the future. It will be shown how, providing these challenges are addressed, it will be possible to locate previously unmarked sites, characterise burial environments, examine human remains, and shed new light on practices of body disposal. Millions of people are known to have died during the Holocaust. The remains of some have been found, but the remains of the majority have not. Only a handful of investigations have been carried out at Holocaust sites by archaeologists, the majority in the last decade, but few have included the search for graves. Conversely, over the last 40 years, forensic archaeologists and anthropologists have played a central role in the investigation of crimes against humanity elsewhere in relation to the detection and analysis of clandestine burials and body deposition sites. Responses to genocide and mass violence in Argentina, the former Yugoslavia, Kosovo, Rwanda and Iraq in particular have seen the development of sophisticated search and recovery methodologies. The evidence collected and examined by forensic archaeologists and anthropologists has been used in court to ensure that perpetrators were held accountable and in a humanitarian context in order to satisfy the needs of family and friends of victims wishing to know the fate of their loved ones. Likewise, in some countries, forensic archaeologists and anthropologists are now regularly employed to assist the police in the detection and recovery of clandestine burials in domestic missing persons cases. Therefore, well-established protocols now exist for the investigations where victims' bodies have been disposed of illicitly. There are a number of complex reasons why the response to the Holocaust has been quite different. Some relate to the attempts by perpetrators to hide their crimes, others to the effects of time. These will be discussed in more detail shortly. However, when the various narratives of the Holocaust and the sensitivities that surround this period are examined, it becomes immediately clear that many of the reasons why large-scale searches for Holocaust victims have not been carried out relate to the way in which the human remains have been perceived by individuals, groups and societies. I will now summarise some of these main challenges that archaeologists may face in the course of their work. First of all, to consider previous investigations. The sheer scale of the crimes perpetrated by the Nazis is one reason why corpses came to form a central part of Holocaust iconography, in that the landscape of Europe was literally littered with the traces of mass violence, both during and after the Second World War. Therefore, in some places, it was not deemed necessary to search for the remains of victims, since many could easily be found. For example, in many areas, liberators were faced with thousands of bodies that had not been buried by perpetrators, and as such, they were faced with the huge task of burying them. These burials were carried out quickly, in light of the need to provide a burial place for the deceased, to prevent the spread of disease, and to limit the trauma faced by those in places where corpses were present. Sometimes perpetrators, and others deemed to have an association with the Third Reich, were forced to rebury these corpses. Thus, one of the roles of mass graves had within the criminal justice system relates to punishment. In many towns and communities, people searched for the dead, and funerary scenes were common sights in the places where the Nazis had carried out massacres of the local population. Some of these sites were marked, but others were not. The scale of the crimes perpetrated during the Holocaust is also one reason why relatively few searches have been carried out. The logistics and finances required to undertake searches was beyond the capabilities of the nations involved at the time, and has remained so since in many cases. Therefore, the investigations that have been carried out after the war often occurred for very specific reasons, and very specific treatment of mass graves has thus varied depending upon local circumstances. At some sites, corpses were not being inhumed, but rather exhumed in an attempt to document the Nazis' crimes. A number of medico-legal investigations were conducted in the immediate aftermath of liberation or after the end of the Second World War, with the intention of locating mass graves and other body deposition sites. Many of these investigations were focused on verification of the fact that graves existed, rather than on their detailed investigation. Searches were not geared towards the identification of victims, but rather documenting for the courts, so far as was necessary, evidence that a crime had occurred, and what happened at a particular place in general terms. The presence and condition of bodies began to be used in criminal tribunals such as Nuremberg in order to attest to the brutality of Nazi crimes. As time went on, in many places the perceptions of mass graves also changed, so that bodies went from something that should be seen as a reminder and a form of evidence to something that should be buried and remain undisturbed. Crime scenes became memorial spaces, and lines were drawn under criminal investigations. This, of course, happened at different times throughout Europe, depending upon the political social climate in any given country. In other places, the desire to search for victims of the Holocaust never went away, but was rather suppressed by politics or ongoing social tensions. Consequently, attitudes towards mass graves can sometimes be a reflection of the complex post-war histories and complex cultural memory connected to a site. In the years since the end of the Second World War, a few exhumations have taken place at Holocaust sites for the purpose of providing evidence in legal investigations. In some countries, the crimes perpetrated during the Holocaust could potentially still become part of legal investigations, since the statute of limitations on the investigation of war crimes has not passed or does not exist. However, in recent years, human remains from Holocaust sites have been most commonly recovered when they've been discovered serendipitously, for example in the course of building work, rather than as a result of proactive searches organised in either a legal or humanitarian context. Rarely have there been searches that have sought to exhume Holocaust victims for humanitarian reasons, and rarely has it been possible to identify victims in the absence of ante-mortem information about missing persons. As the Holocaust continues to sit between history and memory, between a legal and forensic context rather than and an archaeological one, the role of corpses in searches and Holocaust narratives will likely continue to vary. The deaths and disposals that occurred during the Holocaust resulted in interactions between the dead and the living, both at the time and at its aftermath. Many of these interactions were consequently documented by witnesses or were photographed, filmed and broadcast in the media. Thus, in addition to the materials generated during war crimes trials, after the war many sources emerged which further illustrated the nature of Nazi crimes. Hence, mass graves became a central part of Holocaust iconography. In the secondary literature that followed, the gas chambers, crematoria, mass graves and execution sites, as the places where mass killings and body disposals occurred, have continued to be what defines the Holocaust in public consciousness. The prevalence of human remains and mass graves in Holocaust narratives, and the openness with which they are presented in the public realm, has undoubtedly contributed to the limited number of investigations aimed at locating victims' remains, and appears to have led to the mistaken perception that everything is known about the Holocaust because we have these images. In my experience, there is often the belief that the majority of victims have either been found or that the Nazis were successful in totally obliterating all traces of their crimes, and as such it is not possible to find the victims' remains. However, neither is true, and as I will demonstrate later, forensic and archaeological approaches have the potential to reveal a considerable amount of new evidence and locate body disposal sites. There are also many reasons why large-scale searches for the remains of Holocaust victims have not been carried out that relate to the sensitivities that have surrounded and continue to surround this period of history. It is unquestionable that corpses were symbols of suffering during the Holocaust and since. For some people, mass graves became something to forget, something to cover up quickly, and something that should remain buried physically and metaphorically. Some people did not and do not want sites to be excavated because this would bring physical evidence to the fore which is deemed too painful. Thus, by default, they are opposed to archaeological and forensic investigations which seek to recover remains. In some countries, politics, the potential for scandals around blame and collaboration, ongoing friction, anti-Semitism, and marginalisation of minority groups offer just some of the possible explanations as to why searches have not been carried out. Some communities have not encouraged or supported investigations because they are content with the information they have about a particular place. When memorials already exist, some people may question why it is necessary to revisit these places, to disturb them, and to revive painful memories. Elsewhere, it may be a failure to feel a connection to the history of the Holocaust that has resulted in a lack of interest in locating graves. Investigations of Holocaust sites have been carried out in other places as a way of confronting tensions that still remain, and as a way of dealing with the past. But in some cases, exhumations have deliberately or inadvertently led to the resurfacing of old rivalries, for example in the former Yugoslavia. Of all of the reasons that have affected whether searches for corpses of Holocaust victims have been carried out, it is perhaps religion that has been the most influential. Exhumations were carried out in some places in the immediate aftermath of the Holocaust, in order to provide victims with a proper burial in accordance with their beliefs. Most commonly, this was undertaken in relation to the bodies of Christian victims. In the years since, when remains have been to be deemed under threat from natural or man-made landscape change, they have also been exhumed and reburied elsewhere. However, the reason why the majority of Holocaust graves have not been exhumed or located relates to the fact that many contain the remains of Jewish victims. When a review of previous investigations is undertaken, it becomes apparent that in many cases, Jewish halakhic law is a reason why searches have been forbidden, restricted, or incomplete. Jewish halakhic law is extremely complex, but many have argued that it stipulates that a body of a deceased person is tied to the soul, and therefore to disturb a grave is to disturb the soul. There are deemed to be certain exclusions to this rule, for example if remains are under threat, or if they have been scattered or as opposed to being buried within a grave. However, in the absence of suitable non-invasive methodologies in the past, the graves of many Jewish victims have remained unlocated. The scientific analysis of remains is also forbidden in halakhic law. Thus, this prevents Jewish victims from being identified and their remains from being examined to establish causes of death or other signs of trauma. It should be noted that different rabbinical authorities and Jewish communities have different opinions about the disturbance of human remains, and so the degree of opposition to proposed excavations will vary in different countries and in relation to different sites. For example, exhumations of the remains of Jewish victims have been permitted in several cases in Austria, and some rabbis have argued that mass graves of the Holocaust should be treated differently than other Jewish burials. Evidently, victims are on an unequal footing in terms of their potential to be found, identified and buried in a marked grave, even within the same religious group. Conflicting religious beliefs at the same site is something that also must be considered. The Nazis murdered people from a variety of different faiths and cultures and buried them within the same grave. Many Romani people were killed during the Holocaust, but there have not been dedicated efforts to find their remains either. This is likely due to the fact that many Romani people believe that graves are something to be feared, as they believe the dead have the potential to haunt these places, and so they believe they should be left undisturbed. This is, however, a complex issue. Conversely, as noted, Christians often believe that the right to a proper burial with appropriate funeral rites. Some more non-Orthodox Jews believe that the remains of victims should be found and buried in accordance with halakhic law, whilst hidden messages from victims, as I previously discussed, often indicate the desire to exhume remains also. It may be unclear whether victims actually practiced the religions that the Nazis identified them with. Differentiating between corpses belonging to people from these different groups may also be difficult, if not impossible, when excavation is undertaken, and certainly impossible where it is not. Thus, the result is a very complex situation, with a number of different opinions potentially existing in relation to the same graves. In the past, these issues have caused a number of problems for archaeologists seeking to undertake exhumations, and work has been opposed, prevented, and criticised in many cases. Examples include the archaeological investigations at Belzec's extermination camp in Poland in the 1990s, where the Jewish community threatened to sue those in charge of the project, and more recently at a killing site at Iasi in Romania. In light of this discussion, it would seem that there is something of a dichotomy between the investigation of the Holocaust and archaeological and forensic investigation. Standard archaeological methodologies centred on excavation may not always be appropriate and may not be permitted, depending on the context in which searches are being proposed. Practitioners may find themselves facing opposition because of the perceptions of archaeological and forensic investigations. Religion and the law may be at odds in some cases, whilst in others, the fact that the Nazis' crimes remain within living memory can make the investigation of physical evidence extremely sensitive. Thus, even describing the remains as archaeological may be deemed offensive. Archaeologists in particular may face the added challenge of trying to demonstrate why fieldwork is necessary and what it may reveal because of the aforementioned popular perceptions that human remains will not survive or that the history of a place is already known. However, archaeological and forensic searches can be undertaken effectively, provided that these issues and sensitivities are taken into consideration. I would like to demonstrate now this through the presentation of a case study from my own research undertaken at Treblinka extermination and labour camps in Poland. In an area of remote forest northeast of Warsaw in Poland, there now exists the Museum of Struggle and Martyrdom in Treblinka and an accompanying memorial site which commemorates the Nazi extermination and labour camps that existed there. The camps claimed the lives of between 800,000 and 1 million people through a combination of systematic murder carried out at the extermination camp and at an execution site where people from the labour camp were routinely shot, through death through work and also through poor living conditions. The extermination camp was only open for 11 months, between the end of July 1942 and mid-August 1943. But here a complex of gas chambers, killing sites, mass graves and cremation pyres was developed in order to efficiently process the victims in an industrialised fashion. Although in reality the camp was often chaotic, people could be taken from the reception area of the camp and killed in the gas chambers within 15 minutes. The story of the labour camp is less well known, but a combination of poor living conditions, forced labour and executions resulted in the deaths of between 10 to 12,000 victims, including Polish political prisoners, Jews and Romani. The survival rate in both camps was very low, and as a result, only a small body of historical evidence testifies to the crimes perpetrated there. In 2007, when archaeological and historical research was initiated, a number of key questions still remained concerning the layout of the camps and the whereabouts of the victims who were killed there. Despite the scale and significance of the crimes perpetrated at Treblinka, the former camp area had not been examined since the mid-1940s. Even then, the investigation that took place was only cursory. The extermination and labour camps, which cover an area of approximately 4 square kilometres, were investigated over a period of only 5 days. Only shallow excavations were carried out in a number of areas, and although some mass graves and other evidence were observed, they were not thoroughly examined. Human remains that were found were disarticulated and scattered, and were dismissed as insignificant by investigators. As a result, the common perception of Treblinka is that the Nazis succeeded in completely obliterating all traces of their crimes. Therefore, prior to commencing a new programme of forensic and archaeological research at Treblinka, it was important to consider why no further searches had been carried out for over 60 years. It was also necessary to consider how the site had changed in the years since, and what issues needed to be borne in mind when designing and implementing fieldwork methodologies. Key issues included the fact that the landscape of the former camps is vast and that there were no adequate maps of the area. After the extermination camp was abandoned by the Nazis in 1943, almost 2 years before liberation, the area remained unprotected until a memorial was created in the 1960s. No obvious visible remains survived above the ground. By contrast, in the labour camp, some of the camp structures do survive and some of the graves are marked, but trees have been planted across much of the former area. Both sites have been subjected to looting since the end of the war by people looking for valuables. And therefore, when examining sites like Treblinka, it is important to evaluate and document the physical changes that accompany the different phases of use in order to select appropriate search techniques and distinguish between contemporary and more recent disturbances. As previously noted, the limited number of investigations that took place after the war also have played a part in popular perceptions that there were no remains that survived at Treblinka. But it was not clear whether or not the remains of all of the evidence had been found. This seemed unlikely given the scale of the crimes perpetrated there. It is, of course, easy to be judgmental of the approach taken by post-war investigators. However, the Holocaust was unprecedented, as were the legal proceedings that followed, and there were no advanced methods available at that time for the examination of large numbers of corpses or the environment in which they were located. The fact that the remains at Treblinka have not been disturbed by further investigations in the past 70 years implied that a considerable body of evidence would survive, which could be examined using the advanced methods now available to archaeologists. Of course, the religious considerations that I mentioned previously had to be borne in mind at Treblinka, owing to the fact that Jews, Christians and Romani of different faiths were all killed there. Historical research indicated that the graves of victims may contain Jewish victims at the extermination camp, but also a variety of other people. Thus, some ethical issues emerged around the treatment of these graves. The Jewish community did not want the mass graves at the extermination camp to be disturbed, whilst historically the marked mass graves at the labour camp have remained in situ. Therefore, the consensus of all parties consulted about the future of investigation was that the mass graves and scattered remains should be located so that they could be appropriately marked. However, the mass graves should not be exhumed. The investigation at Treblinka also required a consideration of the fact that there were various stakeholders who needed to be consulted, from the museum, from the archaeological authorities, and from the religious communities already mentioned. As a result of these issues, the landscape of Treblinka could not simply be examined using a conventional archaeological approach. The unique nature of the physical evidence at the site and the political, religious, and ethical considerations that surrounded it meant that an equally unique approach was required to its investigation. This was particularly true of the human remains that were thought to be present and which had remained hidden for almost 70 years. A variety of techniques are now available to forensic archaeologists, which offer the possibility to take a much broader approach to the analysis of landscapes of the Holocaust, and many of these techniques were employed at Treblinka. Through a combination of desk-based research and in-field survey, it was possible to locate and characterise burial sites and the context in which they lie. By reviewing witness testimonies, documentary and photographic evidence and drawings, it was possible to re-evaluate the location and form of mass and individual graves and the killing sites to which they related. Primary witness interviews were undertaken where possible, and this elucidated information of direct relevance to the search for human remains, some of which had not been previously recalled by survivors. The detailed examination of historic maps, dating to before the graves were dug through to the present day, helped build site histories. This assisted in the identification of possible burial locations and highlighted how the landscapes had been modified over time. This was accompanied by similar regressions of aerial and satellite imagery. Moving on to in-field investigation, other forms of aerial remote sensing techniques proved fruitful. These included drone survey, which captured up-to-date images from the air, and a LiDAR survey, a form of airborne laser scanning which recorded elevation data to produce three-dimensional digital terrain models. The latter allowed tree and vegetation cover to be removed from the image, revealing the bare earth of the site. Both of these techniques revealed vegetation change and other evidence of ground disturbance, such as depressions and mounds indicative of buried remains. As graves often exhibit such indicators a long time after creation, detecting these changes can be extremely useful, and this has been proven repeatedly in a forensic context. Recent developments in forensic archaeology in particular provide new ways of examining graves in terms of what they can reveal about offender behaviour and processes of inhumation. Even without excavation, this was possible because of the overall form of the graves was determined using a combination of other search tools. Techniques such as LiDAR and differential kinematic GPS survey provided information about the shape in plan, length and width of features from the three-dimensional models they produced. In order to establish the depth, geophysical survey methods were required. These methods, which include ground-penetrating radar, resistance survey and magnetometry, can detect anomalies and ground disturbance. These can then be compared to information derived from desk-based and other in-field research to determine the likelihood that a grave is present. It is important to remember that the corpses of the Holocaust victims will survive in different forms depending upon how victims were treated by perpetrators. These different conditions will sometimes require different techniques to be used to detect the remains and will offer different possibilities for the investigation and discovery. For example, the use of magnetometry may be more appropriate if victims are thought to have been cremated and then reinterred in a collective grave, since this technique detects evidence of burning and changes to the Earth's magnetic field. Resistance survey provides a rapid tool when it is suspected that remains are buried at a shallow depth, whilst ground-penetrating radar survey provides an invaluable tool for deep remains where it is necessary to review in 3 dimensions. All of these tools have limitations that should be considered on a case-by-case basis, and as such, GPR and resistance survey were employed at Treblinka. The data derived from these methods was layered onto and compared with other materials collected during desk-based research and field survey in a geographical information system in order to determine the exact nature of any anomalies recorded. Minimally invasive excavations were then carried out at Treblinka at mass graves at the execution site, as it was not possible to carry out geophysical survey in these areas. Well-defined protocols for the recovery, storage and analysis of human remains were drawn upon from the disciplines of archaeology and forensic investigation during this work. Even though this work was not undertaken in a legal context, it was deemed important to follow recognised standards in order to ensure that remains were handled ethically and comprehensively. Similarly, well-established guidance also exists for the identification of victims and the assessments of remains to establish a biological profile, for example, the age, sex and pathologies of the victims. If these techniques are permitted, it may be possible to identify individuals, return their remains to their families, and ensure they receive a proper burial. However, this type of analysis was not permitted at Treblinka, since the excavations were only permitted to be confirmatory. Although, as already discussed, the investigation of Jewish victims will rarely proceed along the lines of identification, one aspect of Jewish halachic law that has not been widely discussed in the literature concerning missing persons investigations is the fact that to recover the remains of victims who have never been buried in a grave, for example scattered remains, is considered to be an act of kindness. Therefore, archaeologists and forensic investigators may have a key role to play with regards to the recovery of these victims' remains. By drawing on search strategies developed in policing, forensic archaeology and forensic anthropology, it was possible to recover some of the remains at Treblinka and to work with the religious authorities to ensure that they were reinterred appropriately. Therefore, instead of relying solely on one method or one disciplinary approach, archaeologists and other practitioners searching for graves should consider taking an interdisciplinary approach that draws on a variety of techniques, as was done at Treblinka. Many of the techniques available offered the possibility to locate graves without excavation, thus accounting for the sensitivities surrounding individual sites and events, and facilitating searches of a large, complex landscape. By using non-invasive methods, access was provided to a site which was previously off-limits, and thus it facilitated the identification of burial sites for the first time. For example, searches for the remains of Jewish victims buried within the graves became a possibility at Treblinka when non-invasive methods were adopted. Alternatively, if excavations are to be carried out, then an awareness of the sensitivities surrounding this approach is central. By adopting the methodology employed at Treblinka, archaeological research has facilitated and continues to facilitate a detailed analysis of the landscape of the two camps of the surrounding area. With regards to the extermination camp, this non-invasive approach allowed the locations of several mass graves to be identified without having to disturb the remains contained within them. Thus, Jewish halachic law was accounted for. The memorial site remained undisturbed, and the graves can be protected for the future. In total, at the extermination camp, 11 possible mass graves were recorded around the memorial area. Desk-based research indicated that it is likely that further graves exist under the monument. By examining the spatial distribution of these graves, it was in relation to the structures, boundaries, and other features which were identified using non-invasive survey. It is possible to identify body disposal patterns and the way in which the living and the dead were moved through the extermination camp area. Permission was then granted to excavate in the areas where structures were thought to be present, providing the graves were avoided. Scattered human remains mixed in with the demolition rubble of the gas chambers were recovered, reburied and marked, and as such they were afforded a dignified burial for the first time. Although it was not possible to determine whether the remains belonged to Jewish, Romani or Christian victims, this approach was deemed to be most appropriate by the custodians of the sites, since no faith group objected to reinterment within a protected grave. The combined use of the LiDAR survey to map the topography of the camp, walkover survey and archival research allowed several potential graves to be identified in the area of the execution site to the south of the labour camp. Permission was granted for minimally invasive excavations at 3 of these sites. Here an approach was adopted which involved stripping the turf and topsoil away from the areas indicated in the LiDAR survey and digging small minimally invasive test trenches at strategic locations within each feature. This approach was developed as a result of discussions with the museum, religious and archaeological authorities, and drawing on the author's experience as a forensic archaeologist. As victims from multiple faith groups may have been present, and given that the aim of the excavation was to confirm that human remains were present so that the grave could be marked, this minimally invasive approach was deemed most appropriate. It was also carried out in such a way that it would be possible to go back to each site to conduct a full exhumation in the future if this was deemed necessary. The excavations revealed the presence of disarticulated human remains belonging to multiple individuals in all 3 areas. Shoes and bullets were also recovered. The remains were reinterred into the grave and the sites had been marked for the first time. This multifaceted approach was well received by the various groups with a connection to Treblinka as an appropriate compromise. It allowed the religious, ethical and scientific requirements of the research to be adequately balanced without limiting the possibilities for further research if required. Therefore, archaeologists no longer need to be deterred by the fact that there are a number of sensitivities that surround the investigation of Holocaust sites. Despite the assertion that excavation is the cornerstone of archaeological research, archaeologists and forensic investigators are now in a position where they have a number of techniques available to them at their disposal in order to locate both mass graves and the other evidence contained within the complex landscapes of Holocaust sites. The added advantage of these non-invasive methods is that many of them produce digital data, which can subsequently be transformed into valuable educational and research tools which can preserve these sites by way of record and create a lasting document for future generations. For whatever reason the searches for Holocaust mass graves are carried out in the future, archaeologists and other professionals are now in a better position than ever before to shed new light on the crimes perpetrated during the Holocaust, and should rise to the challenge of addressing the ethical issues that will arise when attempting to do so. There now exists a range of methods when searching for human remains, allowing a broader understanding of the landscapes and physical evidence of mass violence to be gained. By taking an interdisciplinary approach towards the investigation of mass and individual burials of Holocaust victims in the future, it is possible to ensure that whilst the mass graves and the bodies contained within them may continue to remain out of sight, they are certainly not out of mind.
Okay. To ask a little bit the same question, is to hear or not to hear, since it was a little bit difficult to follow her, but as a matter of fact, we all, or you, almost all of you, you know her, and it was quite interesting to hear about this indeed very innovative approach, and I think you will be also able during the questions and the debates, you are also going to be able to discuss a little bit some of the points that she mentioned. Since Ivar, you're from the Netherlands, and you are known for your works on Amersfoort and Westerbork, and you did also this non-invasive methodology in Bergen-Belsen, and you are especially well known because of your works in Sobibor and Treblinka, and now you are going to talk about Sobibor. The floor is yours for your 20 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, I will be talking about the cornerstone of archaeological research, which is excavating, although I do agree on a lot of points with Caroline, as I'm also working in Treblinka. It will be a down-to-earth presentation. It's a project carried out on very difficult circumstances in a very sensitive area, which is the Sobibor extermination camp in eastern Poland. As you see, I gave this presentation as a result of teamwork. The Polish and Israeli project leaders Wojtek Mazurek and Joram Gajbi should be mentioned. First, I will tell you something about the project itself, its origins, its organization, then about the results it's yielded. And finally, I will address some issues involving the project and will make some remarks about which we maybe can discuss later on, and which also relate to some questions which were posed earlier on. To refresh your memory, Sobibor was built as a part of the Action Reinhardt in April 42, and it functioned until the famous revolt of the 14th of October 1943. In that time, an estimated 170,000 up to 250,000 people were killed. After the revolt, the camp was demolished and transferred into a pine forest. For me, when I walk in a pine forest on a site like this, I do experience it not as a pine forest. To me, it's an archaeological landscape with structures and features and artifacts, and reflecting on the excavations the last few years, which I joined. I have to say that of all the above-ground structures that have been there, the archaeological reflection is still present. So to me, the whole camp is in fact kind of present. Although various maps exist based on testimonies of survivors and perpetrators, before the project started, the inner structure of the camp was not exactly known. Especially the structures and layout of what's called Camp 3, that is the area upper right where the killings and the body processing took place. And the reason for that is quite simple. None of the survivors ever saw the gas chambers, or Camp 3. And when I look at this, this is one of the reconstructions, it's one of the best, but when I look at it, and now knowing what I have been excavating, I do know that, well, certain structures, for example, that are there are not on this reconstruction, or the reconstruction, or the structures you see, they are in the wrong spot. Basically, it's kind of a conveyor belt process. So you arrive at the ramp, then you go to what's called Camp 2. You load off, you're taking off your possessions, then you go into the Himmelfahrtstrasse, you will end up in the gas chamber, and then your body is processed. That's basically how a camp works. A little bit more about this structure. This is the so-called Vorlager. That's the area where the SS, the Nazis, had their quarters. This is Camp 1. That was the camp where the guards and the Jewish forced laborers had their barracks. This is Camp 2, so which is kind of the sorting barracks where you have to give your belongings, and where the belongings were processed. And then you have Camp 3. And of course the Himmelfahrtstrasse, which is the connection between Camp 2 and 3. The excavations that took place, they are more or less in this area, which means the area between the ramp and Camp 2, in a part of Camp 1 and part of Camp 3. And the reason for that lies within the organization of the project, simply because these were the places where construction works were foreseen, as I will explain shortly. The project, well, basically the project is a monumental redesign of the landscape, but the archaeological project started earlier, in 2007, on a very small scale, as an initiative of the two archaeologists I mentioned, Mazurek and Jaime. Then 4 countries together, the Netherlands, Israel, Slovakia and Poland, adapted the archaeological research into their project, which was in fact the building of this monument in Sobibor. There was a little museum. There will be a big museum and a visitor center, and the landscape will be transformed completely. Archaeology was incorporated in this project, and the project will be started, well, hopefully next year. And in fact, the first version of the design determined where excavations had to take place. That is at the places where the construction works were foreseen, so mainly in the area between the ramp and Camp 2, the sorting area, and Camp 3. This is a later version of the design, and there you see that the gas chambers, which we found in September last year, the foundations of the gas chambers, are already incorporated into this design. Here you see a detail of this design. This is the visitor center. There's a lot of well, arguments going on between the involved countries about the location of this visitor center, because it's in the middle of the camp. It's between the ramp and Camp 2. And, well, some people say, and I have to say I agree, that you should have this visitor center outside the camp. Okay, that brings me to the results of the excavation. Here you see an overview of the area between the ramp and Camp 2 during excavations. And in this area, numerous features of barracks, fences and waste pits were found and excavated. One of the most important features we found over there was this. This is in fact the ramp, which is partly overbuilt by a later built road on the left. And we do think that if you remove that road, that the whole ramp and its platform will still be there. Between the ramp and Camp 2, the sorting barracks, we found lots of artifacts in big waste pits like this one. It became clear that these waste pits were probably dug after the revolt, so which means, in fact, after the closure of the camp, as the rubbish was partly burned as part of the process of demolition and obliteration of traces by the Nazis. The artifacts we found, they reflect, well, in fact, let's say daily use. We found, I think, last year maybe 100,000 artifacts. And most of these artifacts, they do come from the Western countries, and they are not coming from Poland and Slovakia. And that's just due to the fact that the people from the West still were living between hope and illusion and thought that they would go to maybe to a labor camp, a forced labor camp, while the Jews from Slovakia and Poland, they came from ghettos and they knew better. So they had no belongings to build up another life in Poland, because there was no life in Poland anymore. We also found valuables like these gold earrings and gold ring, but not so many, because after the war, this area, especially this area of the camp, was heavily looted. Here we go to Camp 1. This is the famous water well, which is also known by several testimonies, like the one of Filip Białowicz. And he told me that he threw gold objects in this pit as an act of sabotage. And when we found this well, it turned out that it wasn't looted. So we were quite curious what would be at the bottom of the well. And indeed, we found gold objects like these gold rings and gold teeth. Well, what you see here, and then we go to Camp 3. It's the excavation map, the excavation drawing of the gas chambers, which is the building in green and red. The location where we found the foundations of the gas chamber was in fact no surprise, in contrast with the condition of its foundations. The foundations were surprisingly well preserved. Well, here you see an aerial picture of the Himmelfahrtstrasse. This is a few years ago, in 2011. This was excavated. You have to look at the yellow stripe. So you see different roads, which are, most of them are reconstructions of where the Himmelfahrtstrasse would be. And they're all wrong. So we found that the yellow path you see, those are the excavation trenches. And finally, they lead to this asphalt square. You see in the middle of the picture, you see two black lines in the yellow sand, and they end at the asphalt square. The asphalt square was erected there are some monuments over there. They were erected in the 60s. And it turned out that this asphalt square was built directly on top of the foundations of the gas chambers. That was in 2011, and we knew it by then. But we had to wait for a permit to remove the asphalt until last year. And after the asphalt square was removed by hand, the building itself came to light. And I suppose, Robert-Jan, there you have your bricks. Okay, I will go into detail about these gas chambers. This is a little bit difficult picture. I took it from a crane. But here you have the Himmelfahrtstrasse, the road to heaven, to the entrance of the building, which is here. Then you have a corridor, a narrow corridor, and there are 2 sets of 4 chambers on each side. And the chambers on the west, the left, they are partly demolished by a monument that was built and also demolished in the 60s. But especially on the right, the chambers are very well preserved. And as it turned out, there's also an engine room at the end. As it turned out, the left chambers, they were built first, the first series of cast chambers, and the right chambers, they were built later and are an enlargement of the complex. And if you go back to historical sources, then this drawing was very noticeable because of this building. So if you compare our map with this drawing of Frans Hödel, then you see it's exactly the same. Frans Hödel was one of the SS officers who operated the engines in the gas chamber complex. So his sketch of Sobibor it's really a sketch. What can you see? There's little to be seen. How can you can't relate it to anything, in fact, except for the gas chambers, because of the simple fact he worked there. The difference between the old and the new gas chambers are also reflected in the building material. If you look to the west, then you see, well, it's cement and natural stone, and on the right you have really brick walls. Another feature which was quite interesting, these round features. At first we couldn't make anything of it. We thought, well, maybe these are traces of looting. But then I mapped them, and what you see is this. On every connection of walls, so the joints of the structure, there is a feature like that, which leads me to the conclusion that those are traces of small explosions from the demolition of the building. At least that's what I think. We also carried out a sieving program. So we sieved all the ground at the complex and around the complex, and we mapped that. And we found at a certain area to the west, we found objects like these. So bottom left is a gold filling, a silver pendant, a tooth, a denture, a wedding ring. So only objects that naked people can still have on them. And we only found these objects, no other objects. So I think that the concentration of these artifacts reflects the body processing area. In fact, the area where they took out the gold fillings, where the Sonderkommando, the Jewish Sonderkommando, took out the gold fillings. And a spot like that you can only trace archaeologically, because there is nothing else there. There are no features. There's only these artifacts. In some cases, we found also in various parts of the camp, we found personal items, so with names on them. So then you can relate it to a certain person, of which we sometimes found relatives and had pictures. In this case, Lea Judith La Peña, a girl, I believe she was 4, from Amsterdam. So far, all the personal items we found, they were all Dutch, all of them. So finally, I want to make some remarks about this project. Let me stress that archaeological research is important. It provides data, it provides physical remains. In that respect, I'd like to refer to the extermination camp of Belzec, which was monumentalized without any research, thus destroying the last remains and in a way finishing the work of the Nazis. So although the last years, the awareness that archaeological research can contribute in understanding the organization and structure of these camps and also plays an important role in the process of remembrance and reconciliation, providing future generations with physical remains and artifacts, it must be stressed that Holocaust archaeology, in the form of extensive excavations, that is what we call invasive, is a paradox in itself. If you excavate it all, then at the same time you're destroying those remains. That's why Caroline is pleading for another methodology, which is non-invasive. So therefore, in my opinion, an archaeological methodology should be as restrained as possible, based on those extensive non-invasive techniques, and based on a well-written research agenda, as shown in the Treblinka case. So this reactive approach, as done in Sobibor, following construction works, that has certainly its setbacks. Although, for example, the remains of the gas chamber are respected and will be incorporated in the new design. So for the next campaigns in Sobibor, I would like to see a better understanding and collaboration between designers, historians, and archaeologists. Only then you can find this important balance between heritage management, truth finding, remembrance, and monumentalization. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ivar, and especially thank you for this last appeal to a better cooperation between the various disciplines involved, indeed, in this very interesting field. So now it's the time to switch to German, und wir werden tatsächlich jetzt die deutschsprachige Version des Panels anfangen mit Professorin Claudia Theune-Vogt. Sie ist eine Archäologin im wahren Sinne des Wortes, würde ich sagen, und sie ist tatsächlich Professorin für Ur- und Frühgeschichte hier an der Uni Wien und beschäftigt sich also seit rund 10 Jahren mit Forschung, also Forschungsprojekten an Konzentrationslagern in Sachsenhausen und Mauthausen und vor allem bei Nebenlagern von Mauthausen. Frau Theune, bitte.
Yes, it was said that the conference language is German or English, so I choose German, sorry. But my PowerPoint is in English as well, and I have a short English conclusion, so I hope you understand. Seit nun rund 25 Jahren werden first, I want to show you, I try to switch a bit when I show in the slides. First, I want to show you some of the sites where I'm talking about. Mauthausen is here and Gusen as well. Rechnitz, we heard about this morning about Rechnitz. I will say about that site some words. And Graz-Liebenau and Leubel, ein Nebenlager von Mauthausen. Seit nun schon 25 Jahren werden an den Orten dieses nationalsozialistischen Terrors in Konzentrationslagern, Vernichtungslagern und anderen Tatorten archäologische Forschungen betrieben. Seit 25 Jahren und ich selber seit 10 Jahren gibt es diese zeitgeschichtliche Archäologie. Ich präferiere den Ausdruck zeitgeschichtliche Archäologie, weil meiner Meinung nach alle anderen Begriffe wie Konzentrationslagerarchäologie, Holocaustarchäologie oder Ähnliches zu kurz greifen und nicht die vielfältigen Dimensionen der Lager und der Verbrechen von 1933 Fragezeichen, 38 Fragezeichen, 42 Fragezeichen bis wann denn tatsächlich einschließen und auch nicht die vielfältigen Fragestellungen zum 20. Jahrhundert umfassen. Wir haben schon gehört von Simbabwe und Ruanda und auch alles, das fällt darunter. Bei all diesen Ausgrabungen werden die Umzäunungen, die Häftlingsbaracken, werden die Umzäunungen, die Häftlingsbaracken, Funktionsgebäude, Tötungseinrichtungen, Müllhalden und eine Vielzahl von Objekten aller Art und auch menschliche Überreste oder Massengräber gefunden. Die archäologische Beschäftigung mit diesen Orten des nationalsozialistischen Verbrechens und deren systematische Untersuchung begann also schon vor 25 Jahren in Deutschland, vor rund 20 Jahren in Polen und vor rund 10 bis 15 Jahren hier in Österreich. Es gibt weitere Untersuchungen von Kollegen in Norwegen, in Großbritannien, in Finnland. Über die Aktivitäten in den Niederlanden haben wir gehört. Diese Ergebnisse, um auch das kurz zu sagen, habe ich im vergangenen Jahr auch in einem Buch zusammengefasst, das tatsächlich auch den Tatorte des Ersten Weltkriegs umfasst, des Zweiten und auch des Kalten Krieges. Also es wird auch über archäologische Ausgrabungen an der Berliner Mauer dort gesprochen. Einige Jahre später folgten dann auch Ausgrabungen an anderen Tatorten, in denen in Diktaturen oder Kriegen Menschen in die Lager gesperrt wurden, beziehungsweise an Tatorten, an denen Menschen ermordet wurden. In Europa steht mit Sicherheit Srebrenica an erster Stelle, aber auch die sogenannten Killing Fields in Kambodscha, die Massengräber, wir haben das gehört, auch all das, oder in Spanien, all das gehört dazu. Und damit finden systematische archäologische Untersuchungen, ob mit invasiven oder nicht invasiven Methoden, an diesen Orten statt. Die Methoden, die bei diesen Ausgrabungen angewandt werden, sind natürlich archäologische Methoden. Bei der Freilegung der Toten in den Massengräbern arbeiten wir aber selbstverständlich mit Anthropologen oder auch Gerichtsmedizinern zusammen, um auch gerade bei diesen Massengräbern der letzten Jahre den Internationalen Gerichtshof in Den Haag in der Verbrechensaufklärung zu unterstützen. Es war in der Archäologie schon immer ein grundlegendes Prinzip, dass jeder Befund, der freigelegt wird und jeder Fund, der freigelegt wird, äußerst sorgfältig in dem jeweiligen Kontext dokumentiert wird. Jede Ausgrabung, auch das hat Ivar gerade gesagt, zerstört den ehemaligen und einmaligen Befund. Wenn keine detailgetreue Dokumentation erfolgt, gehen wertvolle Erkenntnisse verloren, die die historische Situation, den Kontext beschreiben können. So möchte ich sagen, dass jede sorgfältige Ausgrabung im Sinne der Forensik einen Tatort systematisch und detailliert untersucht. Und es ist dabei unerheblich für mich als Archäologin, ob es sich um prähistorische Siedlungen oder prähistorische Fundorte handelt oder um nationalsozialistische Konzentrationslager. Diesen Grundprinzipien der ganz genauen Dokumentation sind wir Archäologen stets verpflichtet. Das ist aber auch ein Vorteil, wenn in den Massengräbern nach den Spuren der Verbrecher, nach den Spuren des Verbrechens gesucht werden. Die Archäologie verfügt gemeinsam mit diversen Nachbarwissenschaften über die notwendigen Methoden, zumindest diese Dokumentation anzufertigen, um dann bei der Aufklärung der Verbrechen zu helfen. Zusätzlich gibt es an der Universität Wien seit rund 10 Jahren einen Arbeitskreis auch für forensische Archäologie, den Thomas Pototschnig initiiert hat. In dem Workshop wird auch gefragt, ob diese Arbeitsweise auch als Forensic Turn zu bezeichnen sei und damit einen ähnlichen Stellenwert hat wie die wissenschaftsgeschichtlichen paradigmischen Turns. Ich weiß allerdings nicht, ob die hier Anwesenden den Begriff des Turns oder Forensic Turn in der gleichen Weise auch definieren würden. Wir hatten dazu heute ja auch schon einige Diskussionen. Wohl nicht zufällig fällt in die Zeit der ersten Ausgrabungen in den ehemaligen Konzentrationslager auch das Aufkommen des sogenannten Material Turns. Nach dem Linguistic Turn am Ende der 1960er Jahre folgte um 1990 der Iconic Turn und der Material Turn. Ein weiterer Paradigmenwechsel wurde auch durch den Spatial Turn oder den Cultural Turn angestoßen. Das, was Ivar und Caroline auch sagten mit der Landschaft, das geht ja auch schon richtig in Richtung dieses Spatial Turns. Alle diese Neuorientierungen oder diese Turns in den verschiedenen kulturhistorischen Disziplinen sind getragen von einem Paradigmenwechsel, bei dem jeweils eine breite und tiefe Kontextualisierung im Vordergrund stand. Verstärkt wurde nach tieferen und vielfältigen Bedeutungsebenen gefragt, die unterschiedlichen Perspektiven wurden betrachtet. Diese unterschiedlichen Perspektiven werden auch durch die unterschiedlichen Quellengattungen verstärkt. Wortbasierte Quellen unterschiedlicher Art betonen andere Perspektiven als bildliche Quellen oder auch materielle Quellen. Das eine ist aus einem Totenbuch, from a death book from Mauthausen, where the Nazis overwrite several times the kind of death. And you see what we find, the barbed wire, and that's also Schute from Mauthausen, and you see that powerful picture of the SS sitting in Mauthausen, and a drawing from a Czech victim in Theresienstadt. Wortbasierte Quellen unterschiedlicher Art betonen andere Perspektiven als bildliche Quellen oder auch materielle Quellen. Mit Worten können wir Ereignisse und Situationen anders darstellen und bestimmte Aspekte betonen, als es auf Bildern gezeigt wird. Ebenso geben dingliche Quellen einen spezifischen Einblick auf unser Handeln und unsere Lebenswelten. Hinzu kommt, dass in den schriftlichen Quellen selten auf unsere alltäglichen Ereignisse verwiesen wird. Die Objekte, mit denen wir agieren, sagen sehr viel über unseren Alltag aus. So hat sich in den kulturhistorischen Disziplinen die Erkenntnis durchgesetzt, dass für ein möglichst vielschichtiges und valides Bild eine breite und vielschichtige Quellenbasis heranzuziehen ist. Heute ist es, denke ich, auch wirklich selbstverständlich. Wir haben darüber diskutiert, oder es sollte selbstverständlich sein, dass Historiker auch dingliche Quellen oder bildliche Quellen für ihre Fragestellungen heranziehen. Kunsthistoriker nutzen schriftliche Überlieferungen und klassifizieren ihr Bild auch als materielles Objekt. Durch den Material Turn in den Geistes- und Kulturwissenschaften wurde die Bedeutung der Dinge, die genuine Quelle der Archäologen, betont. Dinge sind nicht nur Funktionsträger, sondern Bedeutungsträger für historische und forensische Fragen. Als Archäologen rechnen wir dazu auch die menschlichen Überreste. Die Materialität von Objekten und deren Bedeutung für das menschliche Handeln, die Wirkmächtigkeit der Objekte steht im Vordergrund dieser Untersuchungen. And you see here some self-made objects, and these are very important for me, of the victims, like this is a knife from the victims. This is a knife from the perpetrators. You see here the shoes the victim made himself to have any shoe at all, and you see here the number of a victim to mark his Eigentum? Property, yes. Den Material Culture Studies steht ein breites Methodenspektrum zur Verfügung, um die materiellen Relikte, aber auch die anderen Funde und auch die menschlichen Überreste aus unterschiedlichen Zeitepochen zu untersuchen. Und wiederum ist zunächst eine detaillierte Dokumentation, die Kontextualisierung, notwendig. Forschungen, sei es archäologische oder historische Forschungen, sind von Fragestellungen geleitet. Eine historische, kulturhistorische oder archäologische Fragestellung kann ich selbst aufgrund meiner Forschungsinteressen entwickeln, sie kann aber auch von außen an mich herangetragen werden. Etliche der Fragestellungen, die ich untersucht habe, betreffen die materiellen Relikte oder es sind auch meine Interessen, etwa die Chronologie der Überreste der Lager selbst, die Entwicklung und Vergrößerung der Gebäude, die Installation und Veränderungen, Vergrößerungen der Tötungseinrichtungen, der Umgang mit den Relikten, auch in der Nachkriegszeit für mich ein wichtiger Punkt. Auch Fragen zur Struktur der Lager mit der räumlichen Verortung der Häftlingsbaracken und der Tötungseinrichtungen, die Bereiche, die frei zugänglich waren, die Bereiche, die für bestimmte Personen verborgen waren, all das, also auch das sind raumsoziologische oder landschaftsarchäologische Fragestellungen, auch das bietet sich an. Kleinfunde, die wir immer in großen Mengen finden, können genutzt werden, um Forschungen über den Zugang der Täter oder der Opfer zu unterschiedlichen Objekten nachzuzeichnen. Die zahlreichen Funde, die eindeutig von den Häftlingen selbst fabriziert worden sind, bieten sich für Fragestellungen zur Versorgungsnot mit dem Überlebensnotwendigen beziehungsweise auch zu Überlebensstrategien der Häftlinge an. Auch für diese Fragestellungen stehen die archäologischen Quellen, sind sie besonders wichtig. Gerade im Hinblick auf die zeitgeschichtliche Archäologie erhalte ich immer Anfragen, in dem in einem ein oder anderen Lager Ausgrabungen durchzuführen, um diese Lager für Gedenkorte wieder sichtbar zu machen. Die überwiegende Mehrzahl der 1200 Haupt- und Nebenkonzentrationslager bzw. 50.000 Internierungslager aus nationalsozialistischer Zeit wurden bald nach Ende des Zweiten Weltkriegs abgetragen und sie gerieten in Vergessenheit. So sind vielfach die Motive für die Ausgrabungen von dem Wunsch geprägt, diesen Ort wieder sichtbar zu machen, beziehungsweise es sollen dort Gedenkstätten errichtet werden, um an diesen Plätzen der Opfer zu gedenken. Schriftliche Dokumente aller Art, Zeitzeugenberichte oder Fotografien helfen ebenfalls, diesen Ort zu lokalisieren und geben sicherlich eine Fülle von Informationen. Eine physische und visuell erfahrbare Sichtbarmachung, insbesondere von symbolischen Orten wie dem Appellplatz oder dem Eingangstor, hier rot markiert. Also wir haben hier 2 kleine Pfostenlöcher. Das war ein ganz einfaches Holztor, das haben wir auch gefunden, also dass man dieses markiert. Die Fragestellung betrifft hier also die Sichtbarmachung, um hier einen Gedenkort einzurichten. Grundsätzlich finden sich immer, auch bei Ausgrabungen, die nicht nach Verstorbenen direkt suchen, getötete Häftlinge. Nicht nur die Vernichtungslager, auch ehemalige Konzentrationslager sind Orte des Todes, sie sind Friedhöfe. Kollegen, die in Sachsenhausen Bereiche um die Krematorien freigelegt haben, haben große Mengen von Leichenbrand gefunden. In these boxes, the ash from the corpus from Sachsenhausen. Es ist davon auszugehen, dass unter den Ermordeten auch viele jüdische Opfer gewesen sind, was wir aber heute nicht mehr beweisen können. Archäologen nehmen selbstverständlich Rücksicht auf jüdische Glaubensgrundsätze. Es besteht vielfach die Abmachung in Österreich und Deutschland, dass bei Ausgrabungen zwar eine Bergung der sterblichen Überreste möglich ist, jedoch keine anthropologische oder molekularbiologische Untersuchung. Vielmehr werden die Wiederbestattungen veranlasst und hier ist eins der Gräber in Sachsenhausen auf dem Gelände. This is one of the current cemeteries in Sachsenhausen. In den Vernichtungslagern, etwa in Belzec oder in Sobibor, wollten aber auch die polnischen Kollegen aus Torun, die dort in Belzec ausgegraben haben, das Ausmaß der Lager erfassen, um auch die Massengräber zu eruieren. Oder sie suchten nach den Massengräbern, die im Zuge der massenhaften Erschießungen der polnischen Intelligenz in Katyn, Krakow oder an anderen Orten angelegt wurden. Bei diesen Fragestellungen ging es tatsächlich darum, die Massengräber zu finden und Informationen über ihre Größe zu bekommen. Es ging darum, systematisch zu untersuchen, wie die Menschen getötet worden sind. Außerdem versuchte man, die Identität der Toten zu klären. Das halte ich auch für wesentlich, um den heute noch lebenden Familienangehörigen etwas über den Tod ihrer Angehörigen mitzuteilen und gegebenenfalls persönlichen Besitz zurückzugeben. Ähnlich sind auch die Fragestellungen, wir haben das auch schon gehört, etwa in Kambodscha, Argentinien, Ruanda oder auch in Simbabwe. Bei diesen Forschungen stehen die Verstorbenen im Mittelpunkt und ich halte es wichtig, dass archäologische Methoden eingesetzt werden, um die Verbrechen dann auch aufzuklären. Ich selbst habe in Sachsenhausen, Mauthausen, Guten und etlichen Nebenlagern Forschungen durchgeführt und ich will jetzt noch 3 Fallbeispiele bringen. Eine Fragestellung betraf die sogenannte Aschehalle, Eschheap in Mauthausen. Dort war nach dem Krieg eine christlich konnotierte Gedenkstätte errichtet worden. Es war Zeitzeugen bekannt, dass dort neben anderen Orten Asche und Leichenbrand aus den Krematoriumsöfen abgelagert war. Es stand die Frage im Raum, ob an diesem Platz, am Rand einer Senke, die auch als Müllhalde benutzt wurde, die Asche und der Leichenbrand gezielt abgelagert wurde oder eher ungeregelt. Da auch zahlreiche jüdische Hefte wiederum in Mauthausen ermordet wurden, war es nicht das Ziel, Leichenbrand zu bergen. So wurden Bohrungen durchgeführt. Es wurden Bohrkerne von 10 cm Durchmesser in regelmäßigen Abständen bis in den gewachsenen Boden eingetieft. Die Bohrkerne wurden begutachtet und dokumentiert und anschließend wurde das Ganze wieder an Ort und Stelle in den Boden eingebracht. Die Untersuchung hat ergeben, dass der Platz gezielt für die Ablagerung des Leichenbrands angelegt wurde. Es war zu erkennen, dass das Gelände zuvor nivelliert und einplaniert wurde und dann die Asche aufgebracht wurde und es dann wieder weitere Planierungsschichten gegeben hat. Der Leichenbrand lässt sich bis in eine Tiefe von 4 Metern unter der heutigen Oberfläche nachweisen. Insgesamt wurde dort über 1000 Kubikmeter Material abgelagert. Neben dem Leichenbrand befinden sich aber auch Ascheschlacke oder auch Koks und anderer Abfall, allerdings nur wenig. Bei der Anlage des Denkmals wurde das Gelände noch einmal durch den Auftrag von Erde nivelliert. Der Erkenntnisgewinn in Bezug auf nationalsozialistische Verbrechen durch archäologische Methoden betrifft also einerseits die planmäßige und gezielte Anlage, einschließlich diverser Vorbereitungsarbeiten an einem Ort nahe dem Lager. Die Funde von persönlichen Gegenständen, Sie sehen eine kleine Brosche, die Funde von persönlichen Gegenständen der Ermordeten deuten darauf hin, dass eine sorgfältige Sichtung des aus den Krematoriumsöfen ausgeräumten Leichenbrandes vor der Ablagerung nicht erfolgt ist. Eher im Zusammenhang mit denkmalpflegerischen Aufgaben steht ein kleines Projekt in Gusen. Das Lager in Gusen bestand aus mehreren Komplexen und war im Endeffekt mindestens so groß wie das Hauptlager in Mauthausen. Nach dem Krieg wurde entschieden, dass die zentrale österreichische Gedenkstätte in Mauthausen errichtet wird und nicht in Gusen. So wurden dort fast alle Relikte abgetragen. Eines der wenigen Überreste sind die Krematoriumsöfen. Hier bestand und besteht nun dringender Restaurierungsbedarf, sonst fallen diese Öfen zusammen. Wie grundsätzlich in Österreich und Deutschland werden bei all diesen Maßnahmen auch die Archäologen einbezogen und die Maßnahmen werden archäologisch begleitet. Schon im vergangenen Jahr ist der Bereich um die Krematoriumsöfen restauriert worden und bei den Ausgrabungen fand sich auch ein wenig Leichenbrand. Nun steht noch die Restaurierung der Öfen selbst an, auch der Brennkammer, und auch dort werden wir wieder anwesend sein, um den Leichenbrand, der sich gegebenenfalls noch im Ofen zu findet, oder auch andere Gegenstände zu bergen. Hier liegt die Aufgabe der Archäologie nicht so sehr darin, Verbrechen zu untersuchen, sondern hier liegt unsere Aufgabe darin, dafür zu sorgen, dass mit den menschlichen Überresten ethisch und pietätvoll umgegangen wird. Es ist darauf zu achten, dass alle menschlichen Relikte der Verbrechen geborgen werden und dann wieder bestattet werden. Mein letztes Beispiel sind die Massengräber in Rechnitz, und ich habe jetzt diese Folie nochmal eingeschoben, weil Eva am Anfang darauf eingegangen ist, und dann auch noch in Graz. Mein letztes Beispiel behandelt die Suche nach Massengräbern, in denen die Opfer der Nationalsozialisten liegen, die bei Kriegsende bei den Todesmärschen am Ostwall ermordet wurden. Speziell meine ich Rechnitz, wo Ende 1945 über 200 ungarische Juden auf dem Todesmarsch ermordet worden sind. Und wir haben dort immer wieder gesucht nach neuen Fundpunkten bis 2012. Und ich habe jetzt noch eine Idee, ich weiß nicht, ob man das hier sieht man vielleicht kleine schwarze Punkte. Also ich habe noch eine Idee, wo das Massengrab tatsächlich, oder die Massengräber, es gibt ja auch Berichte, dass es mehrere sind, und es könnte tatsächlich sein, dass es hier sind. Und diese Bereiche sind geophysikalisch untersucht worden, aber nur bis knapp davor. Also maybe there's a chance to find the mass graves in Rechnitz. In Graz-Liebenau haben wir zahlreiche Luftbilder genommen. Es gibt eine Reihe von dicht datierten Luftbildern und es gibt die Zeitzeugenberichte, dass die Bombenkrater genutzt worden sind, um erschossene Häftlinge dort abzulegen. Und wir suchen jetzt, also wir schauen, das Auftreten dieser Bombenkrater und das Verschließen der Bombenkraters, um zu sehen, wo sich mögliche Verdachtspunkte finden. Hier ein Bild noch ohne Bombenkrater, hier haben wir dann einen Bombenkrater und hier ist er dann schon wieder geschlossen. Also es ist möglich, dass in diesem Zeitraum dann tatsächlich dort ein Massengrab angelegt worden ist. So werten wir also intensiv diese Luftbilder aus, um mögliche Verfüllungen in einem bestimmten Zeitraum ausmachen zu können. Dort, wo heute keine Bebauung mehr möglich ist oder keine Bebauung vorhanden ist, können wir dann noch schauen, ob tatsächlich diese potenziellen Orte auch noch tatsächlich vorhanden sind und es eine Chance gibt, nach diesen Massengräbern zu suchen. Mögliche forensische Untersuchungen, die sich an diesen Massengräbern anschließen, um die Todesursache oder auch den Tathergang zu ermitteln und um den Toten wieder eine Identität zu geben, sind davon abhängig, ob die jüdische Kultusgemeinde überhaupt dies aus religiösen Geboten wünscht. Und es ist davon abhängig, ob man überhaupt die Ermordeten bergen möchte oder ob man sie nicht an Ort und Stelle ruhen lassen möchte. Hier kann es gut sein, dass mein Forschungsinteresse den religiösen Geboten und Vorgaben widerspricht, aber ich würde diesen religiösen Vorgaben immer den Vorrang geben, aber ich habe dann doch eventuell andere Forschungsfragen. So in summary, I want to point out that research questions on the Holocaust can today make use of a wide repertoire of word-based, image-based and material-based sources, including human remains. For a long time, only the written sources and reports of eyewitnesses have been analyzed, but about 25 years ago, when the so-called material turn set in, excavations in the former concentration camps made aware of the high historical value of material relicts and the methods of excavation itself. Archaeological excavation methods, and that is the most detailed documentation of features and finds, and thus a systematic investigation of forensic methods, help to uncover crime. If we analyze all available sources at hand and make use of all available methods, we get multifaceted and valid results in the investigations of the past. The knowledge increase concerning archaeological, forensic, or general historical research questions depend on that wide use of the sources and the choice of the methods. In the foreground of my research of Nazi terror is a clarification of the crimes, but also the structures of the systems of the concentration camps or the survival strategies of the prisoners and the victims. To answer these questions, I choose the best way to get best results. This can be forensic methods, but it can be also other methods. Thank you.
Vielen Dank und vor allem vielen Dank für diese Zusammenfassung auch auf Englisch, damit alle Leute Sie gut verstanden haben. Und jetzt, damit wir später noch ein bisschen Zeit haben für die Fragen und gehen wir zu Thomas Pototschnig, auch aus Wien. Und Thomas Pototschnig ist einer der Begründer der Österreichischen Gesellschaft für Ur- und Frühgeschichte und neuerdings von der Gesellschaft für interdisziplinäre Forensik in Österreich. Seit 2005 ist er Mitarbeiter und Projektleiter in diversen Projekten zu unseren Themen und Tätigkeiten. Und sein Vortrag heißt Zeitgeschichtliche Archäologie und forensische Methodik im Dienste der Holocaustforschung. Thomas, bitte.
Dankeschön. Ich bin Gründer des Arbeitskreises Forensischen Archäologie der Österreichischen Gesellschaft für Ur- und Frühgeschichte, die es schon etwas länger gibt, als es mich gibt. Der Arbeitskreis Forensische Archäologie, den ich heute auch ein bisschen repräsentiere, ist eine studentische Zusammenkunft, die sich mit forensischen Thematiken in der Archäologie auseinandersetzt. Zur Archäologie und Holocaustforschung. Das Ziel der Archäologie ist das Aufdecken von neuen Quellen, also Quellengattungen, die vielleicht bis jetzt in der Holocaustforschung nicht berücksichtigt wurden. Die Analyse dieser Quellen mit archäologischer Methodik, aber auch mit archäologischer Methode und dann die Verzahnung mit den bereits bekannten Quellen. Das impliziert, dass die Archäologie im Bereich der Forensik, aber auch im Bereich der Holocaustforschung sehr interdisziplinär arbeiten muss und mit ganz vielen verschiedenen wissenschaftlichen Richtungen zusammenarbeiten muss. Trotzdem ist es so, dass die Archäologie sehr gern mit der Kriminalistik zusammengeschlossen wird. Speziell in der forensischen Archäologie ist das ein wichtiger Punkt, aber prinzipiell bei allen archäologischen Grabungen und bei aller archäologischer Arbeit ist immer dieses kriminalistische Gespür dabei. Ich habe hier nur zusammengefasst die Gemeinsamkeiten zwischen Archäologie und Kriminalistik. Das ist vor allem die Anwendung von mikroanalytischer Technik, das heißt, kleinste Spuren werden analysiert und anschließend in ein größeres Bild zusammengefasst. Es wird immer versucht, einen Modus operandi herauszufiltern. Der Modus operandi kann jetzt sein, die Generierung von Gefäßen, die in gewissen Kulturgruppen immer gleich ist, aber es kann auch sein, wie zum Beispiel Massengräber angelegt werden in verschiedenen Zeitstellungen. Diese Vorgehensweisen werden analysiert und dienen dann natürlich als Vergleiche für aktuelle Ereignisse. Und dann, was die Professor Theune-Vogt schon gesagt hat, die Dokumentation jedes Schrittes in mehrfacher Art und Weise. Also das ist das Um und Auf in der Archäologie. Wir sind eine zerstörende Wissenschaft, wir verwenden sehr viel zerstörende Methodik. Das heißt, es ist unheimlich wichtig, dass wir perfekt dokumentieren und das in mehrfacher Art und Weise. Nun zu einigen Fallbeispielen, wo die Archäologie neue Informationen generieren konnte. Zuerst zur St. Georgs Brauerei in Floridsdorf. Floridsdorf ist der 21. Wiener Gemeindebezirk jenseits der Donau. Dort gab es ein bekanntes Außenlager des KZ Mauthausen. Allerdings gibt es zur Verortung immer wieder Schwierigkeiten. Es gibt eine Erwähnung im Zusammenhang mit der St. Georgs Brauerei in Floridsdorf auf der Prager Straße als Außenlager Floridsdorfs. Die Fragestellung war, was ist dort wirklich passiert, welche Taten sind an welchen Orten vollführt worden. Am Anfang war es nur, dass die Produktionsstätte in Lagerkellern vonstatten gefunden hat. Bei genauerem Hinsehen hat sich dann herausgestellt, dass es 2 Brauereien in Floridsdorf auf der Prager Straße gegeben hat, wovon eine dafür bekannt war, dass sie keine Lagerkeller hatte, nämlich die St. Georgs Brauerei, weil sie im Jahr 1893 bereits neue Technik, das Linde-Verfahren, implementiert hatte und es quasi eine Werbeaktion war, dieses neue Verfahren zu bewerben und eine eigene Brauerei zu bauen. Durch diese Analyse der Geschichte der Brauereien konnte man die St. Georgs Brauerei herausnehmen und sagen, gut, dort gab es keine Lagerkeller, also gab es dort sicherlich auch keine Produktionsstätte. Weiters wurde dann die Analyse von Luftbildern und Fotografien, die Analyse von Zeugenaussagen, aber auch die Analyse von erhaltenen Bauresten mit in die Forschungen einbezogen. Herausgestellt hat sich dann dabei, dass die Zeugenaussagen Josef Bihari, ein ungarischer Jude, der im Sommer 1944, genau am 2.7.1944 in Wien angekommen ist, ein Tagebuch geführt hat und das der Haupteintrag ist, warum die Prager Straße 20, also die St. Georgs Brauerei, die Sie auf dem Luftbild hier sehen, dass er eben die Hauptquelle ist zu dieser Erwähnung. Bihari wurde ermordet am 2. Mai 1945 in Hof am Priel. Das ist ein sehr in der Literatur bekanntes Massaker, wo die SS ungarische Juden erschossen hat. Bei seiner Leiche wurde ein Tagebuch gefunden, das bereits in den 60er Jahren aus dem Ungarischen ins Deutsche übersetzt wurde, und aus dem stammen jetzt auch diese Zitate. Er ist am 9.8.1944 erwähnt, hat er das erste Mal diese Mautner Bierfabrik erwähnt, wobei bei Bierfabrik dürfte es sich ein nicht Fehler, aber Übersetzungsart und Weise für Brauerei handeln. Am 22.08.1944 gab er bekannt, dass er Schute abtragen musste. Und wenn man jetzt dem Ganzen gegenüberstellt, Luftbilderserien von der Royal Air Force aus der Zeit, dann sieht man am 13.09.1944, und jetzt muss ich da ein Stück drüber gehen, hier in diesem Bereich, ja, sieht man, dass da eine relativ große Freifläche mit Bombentrichtern ist. Dort war ein Teil der Malzfabrik, der im Juni 1944 zerbombt wurde, und der Schute, der davor noch dort war, ist im September 1944 bereits weggeräumt auf den Luftbildern. Am 16.09.1944 wird der Architekt, stirbt bei einem Bombenangriff, was auch immer, was da produziert wurde. Am 13.10.1944 musste Bihari Ziegel in den ersten Stock tragen, und am 14.11.1944 ist das letzte Mal die Erwähnung, und da erwähnt er explizit noch einmal die St. Georgs Brauerei, die Mautner-Markowsche Brauerei in der Prager Straße 20, und dass er versetzt wird. Wenn man das jetzt wieder vergleicht, die Fragestellung war, was musste Bihari dort machen? Und wenn Sie genau hinschauen, das ist jetzt leider gedrehtes Foto, Sie sehen hier den Stumpf eines Hochbunkers, der auch heute noch so erhalten ist. Und der momentane Forschungsstand ist dahingehend, dass ungarische Juden als Zwangsarbeit bei dem Bau, zuerst bei der Räumung für den Bauplatz und dann bei dem Bau für diesen Bunker Hand anlegen mussten, und dass die Zwangsarbeit war, die sie leisten musste. Über den Bunker ist bis jetzt, außer das, was ich Ihnen jetzt erzählt habe, nicht viel bekannt. Ein Link könnte sein, der Tod des Architekten. Da sind wir gerade dabei, Bauakten auszuheben und das abzugleichen, ob wir da einen gewissen Link zusammenbekommen. Ein weiterer Punkt in der Forschung ist Archäologie und Graffiti. In vielen Bereichen, Luftschutzbunkern, Hochbunkern, Luftschutzkellern sind Graffiti erhalten, die oftmals Belangloses, für uns heute Belangloses enthalten, die aber auch bei genauerer Analyse zum Beispiel Namen enthalten oder Datumsangaben. Wenn man das bauarchäologisch aufnimmt und den gesamten Luftschutzkeller oder Luftschutzbereich aufnimmt und auch die Graffiti aufnimmt und verortet, hat man schon mal ein sehr gutes Bild und kann schon mal auswerten, wie viel ist dort wirklich an den Wänden. Die Analyse der Graffitis und auch da wieder die Verzahnung mit bekannten Ereignissen aus der Zeit gibt dann schon ein vollständigeres Bild. Was dann ein weiterer Schritt ist, weil vor allem wenn man Namen hat, kann man Zeitzeugen suchen, vermisste Personen melden. So eine Untersuchung hat in den Luftschutzkeller der Brauerei Schwächert südlich von Wien stattgefunden. Die wurde 2012, kurz bevor es abgerissen wurde, noch einmal untersucht. Dort konnten 98 Befunde an der Wand dokumentiert werden. Diese wurden dokumentiert, verortet, eine Analyse durchgeführt und letztendlich sind dort 5 Nachnamen aufgetaucht, wovon 4 wahrscheinlich von ungarischen Jüdinnen stammen. Diese ungarische Jüdinnen waren dort von August 1944 bis der letzte Eintrag ist Ende Oktober 1944. Den genauen Namen und Wortlaut mit der Herkunft findet man in den Datenbanken des Simon-Wiesenthal-Instituts in Wien, aber auch von Yad Vashem nicht. Allerdings sind die Angaben so, dass man vermuten kann, dass es eine andere Schreibweise des Namens sein könnte. Was jetzt der umgekehrte Schritt, der nächste Schritt ist, diese Personen, die Daten zu diesen Personen, die in diesem Luftschutzkeller dokumentiert wurden, bei Yad Vashem einmelden, weil vielleicht bekommt man dann ein besseres Bild und kann vielleicht diese Ereignisse in Schwächert konkreten Personen zuordnen. Ein weiterer Punkt ist Archäologie und Flaktürme. In Wien sind noch 6 Flaktürme erhalten, also alle 6, die gebaut wurden, in verschiedenem Bauzustand. Konkret ein aktuelles Projekt ist der Leitturm im Augarten. Das ist der schmale Eckige, für die es kennen. Dort wurde auch eine Fundsicherung mit archäologischer Methodik durchgeführt. Dort gab es eine Masse an Papierfunden, vor allem an Dokumenten. In weiterer Folge wurde auch hier eine Analyse der Namen begonnen eine Liste an Zwangsarbeiternamen zu erstellen. Das war 2010 bei der ersten Begehung. Sie sehen hier relativ prominent im Taubencode, der sehr massiv ist, Papierreste, die in der Folge archäologisch 2013 untersucht wurden. Sie sehen hier einen Plan praktisch vom Bodenniveau, also alles, wo nichts ist, ist der Betonboden. Parallel dazu das Foto, wo Sie die Papierreste sehen. Hier Einbauten wie Aktenschränke, auch hier, wo es Parallelen dazu an der Wand gibt. Es gab dort auch ein Brandgeschehen. Das Papier hat diese jahrelange, sowohl den Brand als auch den jahrelangen Verbringung unter des Taubencodes sehr lang, sehr gut überstanden. Und wenn Sie weiterschauen, es waren 49 Arbeitsbücher, die bis dato wir aus dem Turm herausbrachten. 13 Namen waren in den Arbeitsbüchern, 130 Namen aus Lohnkarten und 305 Namen aus Lohnlisten. Das sind alles Zwangsarbeiter, das ist alles Material, das in keinem anderen Archiv liegt. Und diese Namen sind das erste Mal, geben mal einen groben Eindruck, wer diese Flaktürme in Zwangsarbeit bauen musste. Einer davon war der Zeitzeuge Paul C. aus Frankreich, der bei der Flakturmbaustelle im Arenbergpark tätig war. Der Arenbergpark ist im 3. Wiener Gemeindebezirk. Als wir das erste Projekt mit IFAG im Arenbergpark begonnen haben, hat die Kollegin Ute Bauer Kontakt zu ihm aufgenommen, konnte ihn besuchen, konnte ihn interviewen und hat auch das Foto links von ihm gemacht. Als wir dann voriges Jahr mit den Grabungen im Leiten-Augarten begonnen haben, haben wir dann seine Karteikarte dazu gefunden. Das heißt, auch hier wieder spannend, es schließt sich der Kreis und man kann archäologische Funde ganz konkreten Personen zuordnen und kann dadurch das Geschichtsbild etwas erweitern. Zum wirklich forensischen Bereich jetzt der Versuch, Leichenspürhunde einzusetzen. Der Einsatz war im Jahr 2006 bei der bereits erwähnten Massengrabsuche in Rechnitz. Es ging darum, mit den Leichenblutspürhunden zu versuchen, diese Massengräber, die wahrscheinlich mehrere waren, zu finden. Es wurde eine Methodik entwickelt, die ich Ihnen dann gleich kurz erläutere. Allerdings hat der Einsatz dieser Hunde mehr Fragen als Antworten aufgeworfen. Und im Sinne der Fragestellung haben wir die Massengräber nicht gefunden. Allerdings ist die Idee jetzt da, eine eigene Methode zu entwickeln. Für die Hunde wurden 6 cm Bohrlöcher in 2 Meter Tiefe abgeteuft. Der Bohrkern wurde analysiert, archäologisch begutachtet und in lebensmittelechte Kühlen verpackt. Die Bohrkerne selber wurden dann luftdicht verschlossen und eine Woche belüftet. Also Luftaustausch konnte stattfinden. Nach einer Woche wurden dann zuerst die Hunde über diese Kübeln, wurden die Kübel von den Hunden und Hundeführern beprobt und anschließend die Bohrlöcher. Wir hatten 7 Hunde an den Bohrlöchern, 6 Hunde an den Kübeln, weil einer der Hunde hat die Weichmacher der Kübel nicht vertragen und haben dann einfach begonnen, statistisch zu erheben, wie rege ist das Interesse des Hundes. Sie sehen da, dass die Hunde wirklich intensive Arbeit hatten, diese langen Bohrlöcher zu erschnüffeln oder durchzuschnüffeln. Jetzt ist es weg. Kommt es noch? Nein. Da ist die Abbildung verschwunden. Hier hätten Sie die Auswertung gesehen mit den Bohrlöchern. Die haben wir nach einem Farbsystem dann kategorisiert und dann im Jahr darauf Grabungen durchgeführt. Bei den Grabungen konnte ein Bunker dokumentiert werden, den man auf den Luftbildern bis zu dem Zeitpunkt nicht gesehen hat, wo auch Überreste von Volkssturm und SS drinnen waren. Also im konkreten Fall waren es Helme und Munitionsreste, aber auch Holz und Abdeckplanen. Momentan ist der Stand der Dinge so, wir haben das jetzt mit Hunden der österreichischen Bundespolizei nachbesetzt. Wahrscheinlich war es wohl der Metallgeruch der Helme, der die Hunde da auf diese Fährte gebracht hat, des Bunkers. Im weiteren Schritt, es wird aktuell ein Hund auf Knochensuche trainiert der österreichischen Polizei, das dauert ungefähr noch ein Jahr und dann sollen Testphasen beginnen, wo gezielt Menschenmaterial vergraben wird und der Hund auf Knochensuche spezialisiert wird und dann können Testreihen beginnen, was können die Hunde überhaupt noch riechen, wie lange können sie Knochen riechen, ob das überhaupt für so alte Gräber noch einsetzbar ist, diese Methodik oder nicht. Das hat natürlich einen forensischen Aspekt, weil gerade in Österreich sehr viele Tote es jährlich gibt, die einfach verschwinden, vor allem inneralpin. Und da wird es dann spannend nach 10 Jahren, ob die Hunde zum Beispiel noch Knochen detektieren können, ob sie es nach 60 Jahren detektieren können, wovon das abhängt, von der Konstitution der Person, aber auch von der Geologie, also auch wieder groß und interdisziplinär. Zum Schluss noch die abgeschnittenen Quellenangaben. Danke für die Aufmerksamkeit.
Also vielen Dank auch dafür diese Beweisführung über die Zusammenarbeit mit der heutigen Polizei. Also das ist auch, wir sind jetzt im Rahmen der Kriminalistik und das ist sehr spannend und interessant und das führt letztendlich doch zu Ergebnissen. So let's switch to English or if we now we still have some 20 minutes or more or less in order to ask questions, to get answers.
It's a question to Ivar and Caroline, who's unfortunately not here. But I wanted to ask you about, since you have an experience in both working in Treblinka and Sobibor, and of course I'm interested in those two camps, how would you say that the framework in which you conduct your research, because of course in case of Treblinka it's a scientific or research project, in case of Sobibor it's a project that is located within a very closed framework of pre-research in order to commemorate the site. That was also the case in Belzec, that also affected the way that the research was conducted there. How would you say, working in those two sites, that practically this framework affects your work?
It affects the work very much, to a great extent. But, you know, you like to compare the research in Treblinka and with that carried out in Sobibor, but the circumstances are so totally different. There is no, let's call it a planning process in Treblinka. There's nothing going on, so you can, you can have your own agenda. You can apply your own methods. While in Sobibor, it was kind of a train on which was driving and on which we jumped on as archaeologists. I think the fault that was made in Sobibor, if you would call it a fault, is the decision that archaeology is at the end of the process. So you design something, the design determines where you dig, and you have to dig because otherwise it will be gone. It will be destroyed by construction works. So you dig there. And when you dig, well, you find something, for example, these gas chambers, and then the design is adapted again. You shouldn't do it like that way. You should do it the other way around. So, or rather, sit together with designers, historians, archaeologists, make a plan, carry out your investigation, and that will determine your design, because the archaeology itself is also the input for a new design and its monumentalization. So, yeah, comparing the both is a little bit difficult because those circumstances are so completely different. And you also have to take into account that in Sobibor, 4 countries are working together. They have their different agendas. So you have all these intercultural communications which are sometimes really difficult to handle with. And Well, I think Rob van der Laarzen will talk tomorrow about contested memories, and that is definitely something what is going on in Sobibor.
So actually my aim was to provoke you a little bit into disclosing the whole context in which the research in Sobibor is conducted at the moment, if you could do that.
Sorry, again?
To disclose a little bit the whole context in which the research in Sobibor is conducted at the moment. So which interests do you have to take into consideration, and how do you manage negotiating with those different actors involved?
Back to politics.
Yeah, well, I think there are two basic problems, which is a kind of different attitude about how you would deal with Holocaust heritage from a Polish view and an Israeli view. I don't think that's a real secret, but it does affect our work. Secondly, no, I think that's the most important thing. If that answers your question, I don't know. I suppose so, with a drink. Yeah.
Jean-Marc.
Thank you very much to you all for this outstanding presentation. My question is about Sobibor. Why are the French not represented?
Well, that's really that is a question, because there were some transports coming from Drancy to Sobibor, and we did find some French items. I don't know. I just don't know.
There was no interest by any French.
No.
Body. Okay.
No.
Maybe one thing to add, because you ask for the actors. One main actor, but one silent actor, is of course the Dutch government, who almost pays everything. And so they play a very strange role, and Ivar knows also about that, of course, but which has to do with his monument, which is paid already, so which means that you are dealing with a sort of Dutch concept of rescue archaeology in a certain way. And it's quite difficult to discuss this with ministry, and not only the ministry, but there's also a great foundation in the Netherlands which pays a lot of money. And it makes the whole atmosphere a little strange in many ways.
And I'd like to add to that on a practical level, which was the second thing I wanted to say, that is that, well, the site itself, as you know, is under the direction of the Memorial Center in Majdanek, because Majdanek and Sobibor, that's linked. And, well, from the start back in 2011, there's, let's say, a misunderstanding between historians working in Majdanek and the archaeologists working in Sobibor, which also very much does affect what we are doing. So I think workshops like this can only help in that respect, because it's really very important that historians and archaeologists should work together.
Jean-Marc.
Very brief question about. Oh, sorry.
Your question about the French people, they did many archaeological investigations in the last years on the First World War. Maybe that can be a reason, maybe.
They were too busy digging.
But
there was archaeological digging in France itself, in Rivesaltes, for example. Just a very brief question: are diplomats involved? Do you deal with the Dutch ambassador in Warsaw? Are there a channel of communication or impeachment? Or?
Only at the official occasions. Okay. The countries that are involved, well, you deal with the ministry in the Netherlands and in Poland and in Slovakia, and Yad Vashem in Israel.
Yeah. Well, these occasions are the moments when the money is given. I was there 2 years ago October 14th, which is the remembrance of the revolt, with some survivors, and then this was a whole day happening, of course paid by the Dutch government, and in such a way that some Germans who were also there asked me if we were also in the perpetrator side. So no, we were the victims, basically. But it was an interesting aspect. But then later that night, there was on the embassy, the Dutch embassy, let's say a dinner of all, well, let's say 60, 70 people, all involved. And at that moment, some checks were given to Krantz, the director of Majdanek, and he could go, he just use it, not even talked about what he could do with it. And that is very, very complicated, of course, because afterwards, let's say historians like us and academics were protesting, because you can't do that, that is absurd. And then later, of course, there is some sort of throwback, and then you give afterwards, you know, way to correct that, but it's not possible anymore. So it's kind of complicated way, but it's normal. This is the way how it works, probably also in the United States and everywhere. There's moments when people start giving money. Yeah.
Just maybe, since I'm the chairperson, maybe I could take the word. Regarding now the French aspect, I would say also that French people are more focusing on Auschwitz, because actually this is where things happen for French Jews or for Jews from France. And I would say also that there is no at all archaeological approach. French Jews dealing with Auschwitz are getting there in order to establish a memorialization of the place. See, for instance, the Judenrampe, see the Maison Rouge, the Red House, etc., etc. I would say this is indeed the way to do, actually, as for now. Maybe it's going to develop afterwards, but also in Auschwitz, I think the coordination is a little bit more complicated due to the enormous debates within the international committee. So maybe it's also blocked through this.
Yes. But I know only for 2 or 3 years the French colleagues begin the work in the Westwall, in the camps of the Westwall. But only very, very few years, and they did many, many investigations in the West Front of the First World War. Many.
Yeah. But there was indeed, and Jean-Marc quoted now the case of Rivesaltes. For instance, in Les Milles, next to Aix-en-Provence, they have opened some 3 years ago now a new memorial dealing with this camp d'internement, Internierungslager, and there were indeed some, not diggings, but some restoration works and some new discoveries, etc. So, and renovation was it.
But archaeological digging.
Yes. So, and this was within France. Yeah.
Something like local initiative and also safeguarding emergency.
Yeah. And I would say in Drancy, there would also be still some place in order to excavate or to evaluate the place. But the problem is Drancy is also that the camp d'internement still is a place where people live. We still have some more 5 minutes.
Again to Ivar.
we remain in Poland.
For some time now, I'm doing research on the lootings of the sites of Action Reinhardt camps, and of course I'm working mostly with documents, with oral history, and with documents also from the police and post-war investigations. And there are, as you probably know, not very many. I only found 4 people who were judged and trialed for looting Sobibor. Could you tell me if there is evidence that could actually prove the history of the looting, and how does it look like, and what was the extent?
The extent of the looting? Well, what I see in the excavation, and I'm not talking about what I heard because that's something different. What I see is that the part between Camp 1, Camp 2 and the ramp is heavily looted. There are traces everywhere, and you can also prove that it's looted because of later coins you find, that kind of thing in pits, for example. I think with some reason, because the belongings of the Jews were taken in there, and during that process a lot was lost or was, as an act of sabotage, was hidden. There are various testimonies of that. The looting in Camp 3 is far less. It's almost, not looted here and there, but not exceptional.
I have a short question as a completely ignorant in forensic archaeology person. What is the advantage and disadvantage of invasive versus non-invasive archaeology? Because I understand why we are focusing on non-invasive methods, but if we really want to have evidences, even these little fetishes, right, we can't find them without digging.
That's true. So you need to seek a balance between both. Non-invasive, that doesn't mean also in the way Caroline it means. Non-invasive doesn't mean not digging. The only thing is that you're more restrained, which for example, if you excavate everything, so if you find, you remove the topsoil, you see features, and you dig out the features, then the feature is gone. Then there's nothing left. You can also dig out half of the feature, or dig out none of the features, like we did in the gas chamber area, that's still there. And then you can show it to people, although you're not able to excavate all the objects. So some objects you leave in the ground because you choose to preserve the features and structures, because they are more important in that whole process of showing it to people. So that's more or less the difference.
So one more question.
Just a second. A question to Thomas Pototschnig. I wonder why no one took the papers you found in the tower at Augarten before. You don't have to be an archaeologist to find them. So, do you have any explanation, maybe, for this fact?
The tower is not so easy to climb up, because you have the entrance in on the second floor, and there's no light, there's no electricity in the tower, so you have to climb up. Then you can climb down, and we found it on the first floor because we were trained on it. The architects, the historians, and even the archaeologists, we were trained on that to find it. And they were mixed up with a lot of doves, pigeons, excrements, yeah. So, and paper is normally not interesting for people who normally enter these towers, because they're always looking for weapons and Nazi signs. No, normally historians do the stuff when they got it on the table.
It's like in a krimi, in a police roman. It's there, but you don't see it. Yeah. That's it. Would be the final remark. One more, and after that, Bella, the organizer, is going to...
well, it's just an informative question, but Claudia, I heard you talking about Katyn, which is a very politicized question, maybe the most politicized case ever. But you brought it a little bit like a sort of normal way of dealing with it, and in the end trying to identify also the victims. But of course, Katin also has this problem of identifying the perpetrators. And the problem of that the site is located not in the country where it is, let's say, where the victims are. So it is now Russia instead of Poland. What kind of problems did you really get when you were there? Was it allowed to do your research? And this is sort of transnational situation?
Yes, the Polish colleagues are allowed to do the research. There are no problems. They can do to Kharkov, to Katyn, and all the other places. The picture I showed was from Warsaw, but they are allowed to do the diggings there and yes, and try to identify all the victims. And they leave the corpse there, and they build memorials there, but they bring the personal belongings back to the ancestors, Nachfahren.
And how did you identify? Was it on clothes,
on personal belongings? Sometimes there are letters, or yes. Many things, passports, letters.
Everything was still there?
Yes.
No DNA?
Pardon?
No DNA?
No.
It was not even necessary then in that sense.
No. Well, you can't identify everybody, but you can identify quite a lot of people. And I think that's very important for the still living family, that they know that their father, grandfather, or what else has his grave there. For everyone, it's very important to know that where father or the grandfather is lying, where he is rest in peace. That's very important for all of us. And so the children and grandchildren, they know where their killed victims, where the killed victims are.
What fascinates me then is, of course, we have this Holocaust cases like Treblinka, the Reinhardt camps, etc. But it's interesting to see that archaeologists are mostly from other countries. Now, you are not from Poland. Why are Polish archaeologists not doing this research in Katyn?
They do. These are Polish colleagues from the University of Torun. Torun, yes, and a Polish colleague who's now living since 20 or 30 years in Norway. And they Marek, yes, well, and they do the research also in the Ukraine and Weißrussland and Belarus, and these Polish colleagues go to the sites where these mass graves are, and they can do the research there. Yes.
Yeah. I know a lot of Marek's research, but this aspect I lost.
Yeah.
Okay. Can I say something? You said that they rest in peace. That's my ethical problem, not as a Pole, as a human being. My question always is, I know it's rhetorical, how many times you can open the grave while looking for justice, truth, because we already know who did it, right? And, I think that some Katyn graves were excavated at least 9 times at least, in different, for different political purposes,
yes, right.
Because there are only political purposes. The mourning is somehow behind it. So that's, of course, this is not at all, the problem which is for you, but I think that's something that we have to remember.
Yes. Unfortunately, you couldn't hear my lecture, and I said it depends on the research question. If there is a research question to open that mass grave and try to identify the people who were killed there, then maybe it's my research question as well, and then I do it. If it's not the research question, and I only want to locate the mass grave, then I say, okay, I know where it is, maybe in Rechnitz or so on. It depends on the question. And I know that it is a political question, that I know, yes.
Okay, thank you very much, and sorry for having to interrupt it. Since we still have something on the agenda tonight, I would say now thank you to all of you and to the audience. And now the floor is Bella's.
Technical announcement. After dinner, which is being served now in the adjacent room, we are unfortunately not able to screen Walter Manoszek's movie. We found kind of a replacement. It is going to be the film Totschweigen on Rechnitz, which was already talked about today, and Eva Kovac is going to hold a short introduction to this film, which lasts about 1.5 hours. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.